Good evening, everybody. As people come in there joining our webinar this evening, you're all very welcome. This is the latest Irish Wildlife Trust webinars. We're very busy with our webinars these days. We did one earlier today on the Water Framework Directive, which is part of a series of webinars we'll be doing to highlight the public consultation on the Water Framework Directive. So do keep an eye on that one as well. That will go onto our website. If this is your first time joining us, my name is Pádraig Fogarty and I'm the campaign officer with the Irish Wildlife Trust. The Irish Wildlife Trust is a national non-governmental charitable organisation, and our aim is to raise awareness about wildlife and nature and its importance to people. And as part of that, we hold this webinar series and we try to keep it free and available to everybody. But if you want to support our work, please do consider joining the Irish Wildlife Trust and becoming a member. It's a fairly small fee. I think it's €40 for the year, and you get our copy of our quarterly magazine and you get all the other benefits from being a member. So please do go over to iwt.ie and consider supporting us, please. While you're on the website, you will see a page on webinars. And that holds all of our webinars and links to all the webinars we've been holding over the last year and a half or so about a wide variety of environmental issues, from farming and rewilding and climate change and all kinds of things. It's a wonderful resource on our website there. It's also on our YouTube channel. Just a little bit of housekeeping for today. This webinar is going to last for about 1 hour. If you want to ask a question, our speaker is going to speak for about 40 minutes, and then we have about 20 minutes at the end for questions and discussion. So if you do have a question, please put it into the Q&A button. You'll see there's a chat and a Q&A button. I won't necessarily be monitoring the chat. So please, if it's questions for Derek that you want, please use the Q&A. The webinar will be recorded, as I mentioned, so it will be available online later on. If you miss any of it, or if you want to share it with friends, by all means do so. Now, the topic for our webinar this evening is a new project called the Life IP, that's integrated project, I think, Wild Atlantic Nature. Now, LIFE is the European Union funding mechanism for environmental projects, and we've had a number of LIFE projects over the years. So this is a relatively new project, and it's looking at blanket bogs. So by now, I'd hope you'd all realize that our bogs are absolutely vitally important ecosystems for the battle against climate change, as well as our biodiversity and as well as water quality. But you may have noticed that many of the government programs and announcements over the last couple of years have really been around our raised bogs, which are the bogs that you find mostly in the Midlands along the River Shannon and so on. But blanket bogs are very different. They're the kind of bogs that you see when you're up in the mountains or over in the west of Ireland. And I think maybe it's just me, but I feel they haven't really received the love and attention that they deserve. So this project will address that. So I will hand you over to our guest speaker today. We're very grateful to Derek for coming along to talk to us this evening. And Derek is the project manager for the Wild Atlantic Nature Life project. He's an ecologist by training. He has great experience in many habitats and species, particularly in peatlands and birds. And I think the last time we spoke, Derek, you were working on the freshwater pearl mussel project, which is not entirely unrelated, I think, to blanket bogs as well. So you're long in the tooth in this area. So thanks again, Derek, and over to you in your own time. Please share your screen, and we're looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Excellent, Pádraig, thanks very much indeed. Can you see my presentation there?
I can, seeing you and hearing you clearly, thank you.
Excellent, thanks very much, and thank you for inviting me to speak this evening, and hello everybody from Westport, County Mayo. We're enjoying the kind of start, the stretch in the evenings here, and it's pleasant to have a little bit of blue in the sky even at this stage. Yeah, as Pádraig mentioned there, my background is in ecology. I have a big interest in agroecology, I would have worked in a lot of different capacities across lots of different range of species and habitats and so on. And in this project, I think it brings various different aspects of my experiences together fairly well in a really interesting project that's essentially a first for Ireland, although we have 3 integrated projects that are about to start at the moment. So over the next maybe 30 minutes, 35 minutes, I'll run through this. The background to it, it's as Porrick mentioned, it's a life integrated project, and you may be familiar with life projects from the likes of the Burren Life and Arran Life and Kerry Life and so on. That would be your classic traditional life projects, and this is an integrated project that is has some of the similarities with the traditional project in that we've got a list of particular actions that that one would undertake. In our case, we've got about 70 or so actions. And aside from that, then we've got 2 key aspects that are different. One is that we deal with policy in a live kind of way, in that as our actions, raise questions or actions or implementation of actions on the ground, be that peatland restoration or whatever. And as we come across policy barriers or policy obstacles or whatever, is that it's part of our remit to look at coming up with mechanisms to solve those and to address those. And in addition to that, complementary funding is a massive issue here as well, and a massive feature, I suppose, of the integrated project. So we've got a basic budget of 20 million across a 9-year funding program from 21, just last year, to 2029. But again, as our interventions on the ground and as we carry out actions in terms of restoration, they often trigger other funding opportunities and so on. So I'll talk about that later on in it. But overall, along with most, or with life nature at least, is that the project is targeted at our Natura 2000 network. So our SACs, our special areas of conservation, and our special protection areas. On account of, as Porrick mentioned as well, a special focus of it is blanket bogs, but you can't really take blanket bogs out of the Natura 2000 network and just try and mend those and ignore everything else. It's all very much connected, and with integration in the title of the project, integration across the Natura 2000 network and out with of that is very important as well. And in fact, even the idea of focusing solely on nature can be problematic. And again, back to that word integration, we need to look at what else is being delivered and what needs to be delivered from these areas, or our clean water, our carbon, our climate, and so on. So I'll talk about that as we push on through it. It's quite expansive in terms of the coverage. We're lucky in Ireland to have a good amount of blanket bogs, and in this project we look at 35 sites in particular, but also adjacent areas too. And again, I'll talk about that as we go. But we run pretty much from the Slieve Aughties, 2 sites in the Slieve Aughties, up through Connemara, North Mayo, through Owenbuffnafen to Glennamoy, across through the Ox Mountains, Culcairn and Cavan, Leitrim, and up into Donegal, up to North Donegal there as well. So it's an expansive area. And to describe the overall project is somewhat challenging because there's a lot of different aspects to it. I'll break it down as we go, and it will hopefully make sense. But there's 3 key pillars to it essentially, and I'll start in the middle of these 3. And I won't show many slides like this. You'll be glad to hear. The first one is capacity building, and in a project like this, where one is focusing on the restoration of habitats and species, with the focus, we'll say, on peatland and indeed blanket bog. Capacity building is something that's massive. That's capacity building of those that manage the land, those policymakers that develop policies that ultimately give rise to actions that the landowners will do, community groups, the general public, and so on. So that's extremely important, and that's underpinning, really, I suppose, of all of these types of projects. So as part of our capacity building, the development of agri-environment is something that's hugely important. Most of our blanket bogs are under agricultural use, and as a result, the overriding policy that determines the types of land use is the Common Agricultural Policy here, and the types of, and the quality, I suppose, on the ground. And so as part of that, the development of agri-environment programs that work is of paramount importance here. Knowledge exchange programs, this building of capacity amongst landowners, and particularly farmers in this instances, but also foresters and the state forestry agencies and so on. And of course, within capacity building, we've got surveys, our community capacity building through training and networking and so on. And then on the right-hand side, we've got education and awareness, and this communication and dissemination of what we do, and through schools programs, through general community presentations and so on. That's obviously hugely important, communicating the complexities of conservation and the work within these areas, and communicating the benefits and opportunities there as well. And immediately when you think of a project that's here to look at protecting the environment, or looking after nature, or whatever it might be, you think of intervention, you think of action straight away. And I think it's interesting that I talked about, or notable that I talked about, the capacity building and communications first. And then on the left-hand side, we've got this intervention, this from invasive species control through peatland restoration, and all of the various other things that you could imagine that are important in terms of the management and restoration of these areas. So although we have a very broad remit in terms of the habitats that we cover, and we look at all upland habitats and species, actually, we including grasslands and heaths and right through the peatland spectrum, blanket bogs are a key focus within the project itself. So just a few little bits on blanket bogs, because we often, well, certainly in the west of Ireland, they're everywhere you look, pretty much. It feels like there's blanket bogs. Certainly in rural west of Ireland, they're obviously very common here, and they pretty much run the north-south along the west coast of Ireland, and right around Ireland, in fact, or at least most of Ireland. So they're a feature of areas that have large volumes of rain every year, usually more than 1.2 meters per year, and they'll stretch from coastal right down to sea level, right up to the tops of the mountains here as well. So they're typically this waterlogged soils that accumulate decomposed or partially decomposed plants that build up over time, and they grow at about a millimeter a year or thereabouts. So your 7 meter deep peatland is probably started to form probably about 7,000 years ago. And in many areas, in a lot of areas, you're talking peat depths of between 3, 4, 5, 6 meters in depth. So there's a huge store of peat there over the years that has accumulated. Something that you'll hear in the kind of the pop statistics. Peatlands cover only 3% of the world's land surface, but of course they store more carbon than all of the other vegetation types combined. And I think that's really interesting to consider. They're not, when we look at peatlands, we think of, it's hoovering in or sucking in all of the carbon, but they're like a battery. They need attention to take in the carbon. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but they release it very, very easily. So intact peatlands store that carbon very well. They're extremely efficient, and really they're a huge opportunity from a carbon and from a climate perspective in the context of Ireland, and indeed peatlands from a peatlands perspective throughout the world. So, and again, a bit more another pop statistic here, just in the top 150 millimeters, you're talking more carbon per hectare than a tropical rainforest. Wow, you say. But anyway, that sounds like something off just a minute quiz, but it's pretty phenomenal. The point is they're extremely important for storing carbon, and again, it's where you've got a properly functioning blanket bog. It is something that takes in relatively small amounts of carbon, about 1/4 of a ton per hectare per year, forever. You know, so it's constantly accumulating carbon, and that's really important to bear in mind. But of course, if you sink a knife into the sponge cake as it's rising, it'll fall and it'll collapse. And that's exactly the case with blanket bog, where it's modified, where it's drained, where its peat has been extracted. If there's intense grazing, where you've got bare peat, you've got loss of carbon there as well. So it's heavily weighted on the losses, because if you have a fairly degraded peatland, will lose about 6 tons of carbon per hectare per year. So that puts it in general context. And of course, you know, everywhere you look in the west of Ireland, you've got examples usually of very bad quality peatland, and you often have some very good quality peatland as well. So the likes of the mountaintops, you may have the likes of this hagging that would tend to be from erosion of one type or another, and of course in that, on the left hand side, you'll see that there's virtually no peat left. They're just left in hags as such. And on the top photo there as well, you see obviously a stack of turf, and in the background you've got that band of forestry there as well. And that's really, I think it's really interesting from the perspective of the uses and how we see and how we've used how we use peatlands now and how we've used them in the past there as well. And of course, you know, peat extraction, turf cutting, the plantation of conifers and so on deep peats is all gives rise to the loss of peats from these, and degradation to water quality, and so many issues from that perspective. The drainage of peatlands as well gives rise to massive issues in terms of flooding as well, because they act as a very good attenuator of water too. And the photo on the bottom there is a more intact blanket bog. And again, this is one that sequesters carbon, or takes in carbon, and slowly, about 1/4 of a hectare, 1/4 of a ton per hectare per year. So that's pretty much the picture of the suite of blanket bog types that we have, in terms of the threats, in terms of quality, in terms of how we've used them over the years. But to bounce on to where we're at now, and the causes and the drivers behind the threats that we have, we think, well, why would someone go and drain a bog? Why would someone do X, Y, and Z? Burn a bog, perhaps? And that, and many other habitats that we have in Ireland, most of our farmed habitats at least, are the primary drivers behind actions there are usually the larger policies, like, for example, the Common Agricultural Policy here. And in terms of addressing the conservation measures and the conservation issues relating to habitats and to our landscape, one really has to look at what policies give rise to these actions in the first place. And just in terms of talking about our peatlands in the West that are in the subject of this project, you know, we can see that there's massive institutional barriers and organizational barriers in environmental improvement in these areas as well. And that's ultimately down to the policies, 2, 3, 4 separate policies that pull in completely different directions: agriculture policy, nature policy, water quality policy, climate policy, all with different messages pulling in different directions. On the left-hand side there is just a little icon from the last EPA report on our water quality. And we know that over the last 30 years, there's been a 10-fold decline in our pristine water quality. And these are often associated with these types of habitats that we're dealing with here. We know that the increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been fairly phenomenal over the last number of years, particularly indeed from land use change. We know in this amber and red bars, we know that the quality of our most important habitats, of our annexed habitats under the Habitats Directive, are in bad or inadequate condition. The vast majority of them are. And we also know that from the European Court of Auditors perspective, in their reports on the efficacy of CAP at delivering for biodiversity, we know that that has failed. And we know that in, for example, the last cycle, that we haven't delivered what we need to deliver, because we can see that we've still got our declines of species and semi-natural habitats and so on. So when we think of a digger out in a bog digging a drain, or a grassland digging a drain, that's not really the damage. The damage is very often the policy that has given rise to that in the first instance. And that's really important to bear in mind. And it's really important to bear in mind because when we think about solving the problems here, we need to think about the drivers behind these and look to adjust those. So we know that over the past 30, 40, 50 years, we have had different and kind of pinpoint focuses on different types of land use policy. The idea of planting the uplands with conifers, it was a great idea at the time. It created jobs. We didn't know anything, or we relatively, not many of us knew much about the importance of peatlands in that context. From a flooding perspective, we often look at dealing with the symptoms. We don't think about dealing with the causes of that. So we go and build an embankment, or we take some rash measures in terms of how to deal with that. We don't take this broad integrated approach. And indeed, in terms of nature conservation as well, we can sometimes fence off and abandon almost, if that's the correct term, and focus solely on a certain area for biodiversity or single species or single habitat type, without considering the integration and proper management of that. And any of those in themselves, be that sole focus on even only water quality, only carbon, only wildlife, only flood relief, is a problem. We need to consider all of these. So an integrated approach is something that's hugely important. So we're very lucky in Ireland to have, and I would say that we're well ahead, I would say, of all other member states. It might sound fairly brash to say, but like in agri-environment innovation, I think in Ireland we're very lucky to have some excellent projects. I think particularly coming from the likes of the Burren programme and the ethos and this idea of how the Burren developed and what the mechanisms that they use to align the policies, I think we've learned a lot, and we've developed really nice EIPs, in European Innovation Partnerships, that have broadened those out, and we've got quite a few of those at the moment. So we know that there is excellent examples over the last number of years of how a lot of our problems can be solved. And we do know the ingredients of those. So we do know that they need to be locally adapted. So they need to be results focused, and they need to be practical as well. They need to work on the ground, and they need to be developed with the people of these areas. And you don't need pilots everywhere by any means, but you do need to develop it in an area that's similar to where it's going to be rolled out. So a program that's developed in in a more East Cork isn't going to work up in West Donegal necessarily. Some of the principles may be exactly the same, but consideration needs to be there. Properly and fairly funded programs are obviously very important as well. And very often in the past, we have developed our programs around almost pie in the sky costings. So they've been enough to be acceptable to a farmer, but they haven't been related to anything that's actually truly been delivered, because some farmers deliver biodiversity, nature, water, carbon sequestration, unlike any others, and are absolutely phenomenal at it. And their income, really, they need to be rewarded massively for that. And then others, don't. and they shouldn't be rewarded for that. So the idea of paying the same is something that's important to consider, or not paying the same rather. Facilitating flexible and adaptive management is something that's hugely important too. We all do things differently. So we have different times that we do things. We are good at different things. Everybody attending this evening, has their way of, I don't know, buttering the toast, for example. It doesn't make any difference if you butter it with your left hand or your right hand, or if you use a spoon. The point is, there's butter on the toast. So that's the bottom line on it. I think historically we've been so preoccupied with prescriptive approaches that you must butter from left to right with your right hand at this time of the evening, and that's what one is paid for, rather than actually standing back and thinking, well, what are our objectives and what do we want out of that? I'll talk about that in a minute. The next point is local trust and capacity. Local trust goes without saying, the idea of trust between project teams and the farmer, and vice versa, and the farmer and managing authorities like your departments and so on. And capacity is hugely important as well. The capacity for farmers to understand and landowners to understand how these kinds of programs work. The capacity of managing authorities like your Department of Agriculture, or your likes of National Parks and Wildlife Service to understand their role in these as well is hugely important. And facilitating improvement is a really interesting one as well. The idea that, traditionally all and throughout Europe, generally agri-environment schemes are everybody gets the same money. Regardless of really what's being delivered, everyone has a budget. They reach that budget, and then that's the cutoff. But as I mentioned earlier, some people are extremely good at delivering the product, and others are useless at it. Some people will, you'll ask for some food and they'll present you with the most fantastic meal with beautiful wine and all of that. And others will maybe give you beans on toast, and you wouldn't expect to pay the same for that. And if the person that had the beautiful meal and produced that got the same as the person for beans and toast, it would probably reduce their standards. And likewise, the guy with the beans on toast isn't going to, I don't know what they're going to be thinking. But that's the way it is at the moment, and that's the way the agri-environment programs have operated. So it's important to the idea that you can improve, you can bring on your product to a better standard to actually get a better income. And that's important. And then factors outside the farmer's control is something that's hugely important as well. And this is the consideration of these, the development of these schemes. So a very good and nifty approach that has been developed over the years is this results-based approach. And that's something that has started in the Burren. This idea of increased payment for increased quality on the ground. Typically, habitats are scored out of 10. So the better the quality of the peatland, or the better the quality of the grassland, the more flower diverse or plant diverse, or woodland for that matter, the higher the payment. So 10 out of 10 gets an excellent payment, a 0 out of 10 gets no payment. It's as simple as that. And that in itself has a very strong impact of aligning policies. So, and in the design of these programs, and it's something that we've been doing in this project, the aligning between the different deliverables, the key ecosystem services, I suppose, for want of a kind of a crude term, but thinking of things on an ecosystem level and what's being delivered there and what's important there. Your water, your biodiversity, your climate or your carbon are really, really important aspects. And we know that they will be very important, in future and so on. So the design of those programs, the design of that scoring mechanism to capture those is hugely important, but it's challenging. So where you're trying to incentivize improved habitat quality, and habitat quality is an excellent surrogate for water quality, because the better the quality of the habitats and providing all things being equal in terms of connections with watercourses, the better the quality of the watercourse itself and the rivers. So in our instance, our big approach is that we reward high quality and we incentivize the improvements of poor quality. So we don't go around looking for bad quality and try to improve it, or we don't go around wagging fingers necessarily. We focus on quality and we reward that, and we essentially provide training to how to achieve that for those that are interested. And that has a very interesting effect, and that taps into all of those different things that we've learned from those previous programs up above that I mentioned. So using a whole farm approach is something that's hugely important as well, and that's something that we do. So what's underpinning all of this? What's underpinning your score out of 10 and whatever? Well, it's a simple scorecard, and it's a simple scorecard that has a number of multiple choice questions on that. How many of these species are here? Whatever tick. What's the cover of sphagnum mosses and lichens, whichever one it is? Is there rhododendron on the site? Yes or no? And so on. So as you go through that card, you'll gain points some places if you've got rhododendron, or if you've got extensive drainage, you'll lose points and so on. And ultimately it's scored out of 10. But this card becomes a huge point of engagement from a farmer's perspective, because they understand, they look into their field, they look at, they understand that it's quality related, and that the higher the score, the higher their payment. But it also allows us all to look at the land in 3D. So instead of looking at it and thinking, well, it's a designated site or it's not, we can look at it in terms of quality. And intuitively then you look at the land and you think, well, what does it score out of 10? And if you can score it out of 10, you can identify why it isn't scoring 10 if it's not scoring 10, or at least scoring highly. And you can say, well, oh, there's rhododendron, or there's drains in it, or whatever it might be. And your immediate restoration or your remedy to that is whatever has brought you down in the point. So it's a really good self-intuitive way of actually working with that. So the payment streams are actually very straightforward. Your results-based payment is basically the higher the score, the higher the payment. What does one do for it? They do nothing for it. Essentially, that's the quality of the habitats that give rise to that. Where lower scores are there, you've got this supporting actions budget, and that is where the actions kick in. So instead of a project like ours, self-running around looking to incentivize restoration of one type of habitat or another, it's that the overall scoring mechanism is actually what does that and gives rise to a demand for support and financial support and advice to actually improve these. And here are some examples from, in this instance, the Pearl Mussel Project EIP that we use in Wild Atlantic Nature too. These are, typical, in this instance, they're drain blocks that improve the score, improve the quality, obviously, improve the score, improve the payment. So it's not a case that we're looking for people to do X, Y, and Z, but rather that they can simply look through the card and decide, well, do they want to do it, yes or no, and it has that impact of aligning the various different policies through this scorecard approach. So so here's just some other examples of that. So again, from a farmer's perspective, you've got this market. The higher from a farmer's perspective, the higher the quality of the animals that are brought to the market, the higher the price, and it makes complete sense that the higher the ecological quality, the higher the payments there as well, and across multiple deliveries. So within our project, project area, we started with a specific site on Duffnafen SAC in Mayo, and we had 167 farmers across 20,000 hectares of land in the program last year, and ran a lot of training programs for all sorts of groups from around the place, and obviously particularly advisors who are responsible for a lot of the scoring in the project as well. In 2022, we'll be rolling this out to 800 farmers. We're in the process of that at the moment, actually, with farmer meetings, farmer meetings a lot of the evenings. So that's essentially filling a stopgap towards the CAP and to build capacity for the CAP strategic plan from 2023. So that's a big focus of ours at the moment, and that has been a primary focus. And from January 2023, we'll have cooperation projects that cover this area here. And these cooperation projects are essentially, they're called cooperation projects because it's part of the article in the Rural Development Programme under which they are funded, the cooperation article. And they're really, really interesting. I think they're one really positive element of the CAP strategic plan. I think they will work well. I'm really, really hopeful for them. And the idea of the principles that I've just discussed will be, and we hope to knit it into a broader scale policy across some of the most sensitive areas in Ireland. So I won't go into the kind of the specific details of where the funding, but ultimately the results-based element of it comes from one measure under the RDP. The supporting actions comes from another, and the cooperation element refers to the groups that will run these programs, along with input from government agencies and local authorities and so on. So again, that's I think really exciting, and I think one major aspect of that is that there will be a real push, I think, from landowners for supports for restoration, supports for areas that need large-scale restoration, and that are over and above what CAP can fund from, and that's where within this we would hope to be able to help. I've shown this slide already, but just to kind of bring us back, this capacity building is a huge aspect of this, and the land management, and of course the education and awareness is something that's very strong as well. And a part of the project, one of the aspects of the project is the communication strategy for Natura 2000 areas, and it's something that we've been working on with our consultants actually on this, Red Seed, the marketing consultants, and I mean the findings of that are extremely interesting, and we'll be hopefully publishing a summary of that soon enough, in terms of the level of awareness, the reasons for lack of awareness, the fraught nature of designations in some areas, the massive opportunities that are there in others. So that's a big aspect to it, and our obviously our communications and networking is something that's ongoing and vital, and again it feeds into that broader capacity building. And just to on the home run now, essentially of the last couple of slides, but I mentioned one of the aspects that is quite interesting of this project, which is the integrated nature of it across government departments, and we have 10 government departments involved in this project as partners, including Department of Housing, local government, and heritage that I work for myself, and that is this complementary funding aspect, which is really interesting here as well. We don't have budget. We've got 20 million, which over 9 years is a relatively small amount across the ambition that's set out. But in addition to assisting in the likes of the development of the cooperation projects and so on, we've applied and we've been successful in some other funding bids for the likes of Horizon 2020, and we're part of Waterlands, which is a really exciting Horizon 2020 funded project, and our overall budget of that project is 23 million, but our section of that is 2.1 million. That is again to develop in new areas, in this instance Culca and Niran. But we've been working with different funding organizations, corporate, private, philanthropic, and all sorts, across a whole wide range, from a societal equality perspective through, in terms of women farming groups in Natura areas, through fuel poverty, the idea of retrofitting houses, and reducing the reliance on the likes of turf burning in these areas. So, and many other restoration project, habitat restoration projects. So with the, and again, we've been approached by some community groups over the years, over the last number of months rather. It has felt like years actually, because it has gone, a lot has happened in that time. But another really exciting opportunity here, and something that we've been working on with Leanan Development Association in South County Mayo, is this community-led rhododendron control project. And that's fascinating from the perspective of one that's developed by the local community. They work with and supported from support from the likes of Wetland Survey Ireland and different government departments that have supported the training of local farmers, the mapping of this, and going through the full good practice in terms of deciding and prioritizing restoration areas and coming up with a long scale and a long-term plan for rhododendron control in that situation. So it's really exciting, and we've got quite a few of those types of projects on the go. And then just to all but conclude this in the last slide, overall, we know that in these areas that looking at, again, a crude term, goods and services that are provided are phenomenal in these areas when they're in good nick. But ultimately, in this project, and generally, quality is the key platform here. So we don't go out looking for the damage necessarily. What we do is that we reward this quality so that our farmer payments relate to high quality. There's little or no payments for poor quality. So the impetus then is to seek to actually improve from a tourism perspective, and from that aspect, the idea of considering things on a quality perspective is very strong. Not to mention land use planning and the opportunities with the likes of food labeling and our Natura marketing. So just to conclude, I suppose as a parting piece, it's a very, very broad project in itself, but we're looking at this, it's ultimately the development of this integrated land use policy that crosses your people practice and policy in itself. And this overall focus on quality that really invests in landowner skills and understanding and experience of these areas. And the opportunities, I think, with local communities, we've quite a few partnerships with various different local communities throughout our area. I think that's very exciting as well. So there's information on our website there, which is wildatlanticnature.ie, and there's contact details there. I think you'll find them through that. And that's it in a rather large nutshell. I thank you very much for your attention. And I think we're happy to take questions.
Thank you so much for that, Derek. Wonderful work. Great to hear about these projects up and running. As you mentioned, we have experience of these projects. I think the Burren is probably the real innovator for all of these, going back probably 20 years now. And Ireland is seen as at the forefront of this kind of innovation. Before I go to the questions from our audience, I mean, you're working basically at the coal face of ecological conservation, and you're dealing with the farmers, and you're talking to the farmers every day. And I mean, they're the people who own the land, and if we want to address the climate and biodiversity emergency, we need the farmers on board and on side. Can you give us a flavor maybe of the interactions you have with farmers, how those conversations go, how they're faring these days, and in relation to your project as well?
Yeah, I mean, as you know, and as I mentioned earlier on, that nearly all of our, like most of Ireland, 75% of Ireland is farmed. And when it comes to the West, it's a much higher proportion, and those areas that aren't farmed are probably under forestry or underwater. So farmers are absolutely crucial here, and farmers are, I would say, by far our biggest resource. They live in these areas. They respond to policy immensely well, and they have responded pretty much on cue every 7 years, with every new cap cycle as such. So in terms of I suppose realizing that and realizing that resource is absolutely massive. I think what's extremely important there as well is the idea, and one aspect of the results-based program and the results-based approach is that it very much taps into that experience. It is intuitive to the farmer and to everybody, what the quality of a hillside might be, or the quality of a field. And to that end, farmers like that approach. They think it's fair. They think the idea that if you're delivering more, that you should be paid more. If your land is better quality, you should be paid more for that. I think a massive aspect to it, though, is that there've been maybe, I'm trying to think of the maybe the most diplomatic way. I don't think they've been talked to very fairly. I don't think there has been advocates for farmers from the environmental side of things and the environmental goods that they deliver. I don't think they've been represented all that well. I think we all need to improve our understanding of agriculture policy. I think the integration of ecology and agriculture could be a lot better throughout our country. I think it's too easy to look at them and us. So I think the more we know about each other, the better, you know. But the willingness is massive. The fear is also massive. The fear of us, to some, is pretty big as to what is this about? Who are these people? But generally, we've had extremely high interest in it. So we're talking about, you know, maybe 90% uptake from all farmers in the areas that we'll be working in, you know.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. We also saw in one of your slides there that you had the European Commissioner there visiting. I think that was last year, wasn't it? The Mr. Sinkevicius, and you've had a number of politicians eager to get their photo taken. And so, I mean, this model is working for the European Union. It's working for national politicians that like to see it. So why don't we see more of it? What are we missing? Why are there so few, and why are the spatial extent of them so small relative to the amount of farmland that we have, do you think?
I think we need to. I think we need to up our game. I think we have in Ireland. I must say, in fairness, the idea of taking this big step of rolling out these cooperation projects is a big step from a European perspective. But I think the next step needs to be much further and much more ambitious here and throughout Europe. I think it was acknowledged in the European Court of Auditors reports that there is a reluctance to engage in these results-based programs. And there's a big fear. It's actually a really interesting reflection of farmers' fear of new change. Policymakers and administrators fear this change as well, because it's different. We don't like change like that. And when things are slightly out of our control, or just because they're different, we tend to shy away from that. But the prize is very good. We do need more people with a better experience and better knowledge of the working of agriculture policy, which are the key drivers of this. And perhaps we don't have enough. We kind of leave it to them, or someone else leaves it to somebody else, and then it's ultimately in the hands of maybe administrators that make these decisions.
And speaking of change, we have a new common agricultural policy coming in at the start of next year, that's 2023. Is that the game changer that we need, do you think, or what's in it for nature?
Well, I think I'm really hopeful about the cooperation project approach. I think for the first time ever, we've removed maybe a perverse incentive perverse incentive towards damage towards the environment, I think. And the messages are more aligned now. So in other words, you can be rewarded for better quality habitats on the ground. And it's something that the vast majority of farmers are generally very happy to deliver if needs be. It's not a case of, there's a lot of misconceptions with something like rewetting. And rewetting is probably not a very good term either. In terms of peatlands necessarily, reactivation of peatlands is something that's much more accurate, more accurate way to actually describe it. But there is fear there amongst some, but ultimately I'm really confident that it can capture the flexibilities that's needed. I mean, it remains to be seen. We can't tell how it will actually work on the ground necessarily, but I am really hopeful, and I feel very positive that we can build from there, and we can build perhaps our food products, our marketing from there as well. So if you know that your food has come from a high scoring farm, it is the outputs are irrefutable, and they're scientifically based as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, great to hear some positivity there. I'll go to our attendees now, because we have quite a few questions here, and Barbara was very early off the mark getting her question in, and it's an interesting question, and it's a little bit controversial, Derek, and it's about trees on peat. And she's in Inishowen in Donegal, and she has a local group of people who are trying to create woodland corridors, but they have areas of blanket bog, and we don't want trees necessarily on blanket bog. And so she's asking for advice maybe on maybe just to recouch her question, what is the place for trees in these areas? Go ahead.
Well, yeah. Well, look. As it stands, Ireland is pretty depauperate, as you know, in terms of our tree cover, and I think that there are many areas that they're extremely that they really need to be, and there are areas that they should never have been planted. Your deep peats is somewhere that really needs to be avoided, generally speaking. And the kind of intervention of those will give rise to drying in some catchments, like freshwater pearl mussel catchments, where flow is the key. This regulation of flow is so important. The impacts of trees can actually be very negative over a good period of time until they stabilize, but they usually don't stabilize for about 60 years or so, like to function like somewhere like Sweden. So I think keeping to your mineral soils is really important, or your shallow, more heathy areas, your areas of bracken, your areas of scrub areas along those. Usually there's corridors to be had from that perspective.
Yeah. It is a very interesting area, and it's one that I think we're going to have to grapple with in the coming years as well, because as well as the common agricultural policy, we have new forestry policies and so on coming on stream, but it's an interesting debate. Claire is asking, what are the types of invasive species being encountered, and what are the techniques that you're using to remove them?
Well, rhododendron is the key one, really, and for that it's there are some videos online, but notching and a small shot of glyphosate is the only way to deal with those. So it's wounding the larger stems, and a little hand sprayer, so there's no kind of diffuse damage as a result of that. That's really it. Now there are other you can cut and paint on, but ultimately it does need to be chemically treated.
Have you seen any evidence to suggest that maybe reactivating the peat, as you put it, has maybe slowed down or prevented colonization by rhododendron? Do you think that's a factor?
Yeah, it is a factor. I mean, you'll have rhododendron will march along the dry bank. Gorse will march along the dry bank as well, and they'll follow the drainage banks. And of course, it'll move into the wetter areas, and it'll dry enough for itself to move on further and further. So, yeah, that they're rhododendron. they do very well in peatland, of course.
Yeah. So as it suggested, restoring the functionality of the landscape will help in the fight against invasive.
It does help. It does help. Yeah.
Yeah. And lodgepole pine, is that a problem in your view?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean, all of the non-natives. I mean, lodgepole pine takes up a huge amount of water there as well. So removal of that from a deep peat site will bring the water level up about nearly a meter, actually. So it's pretty immense. It's pretty immense.
I see. Shane is asking a question about natural capital, and he's wondering, can you comment on the potential and or risks of a natural capital accounting approach?
Ooh, natural capitalism. No. Yes, it's really interesting. Now, I'd need a glass of wine and to go into that. I think there are some excellent. I think the work of Jane Stout and Natural Capital Ireland, I think they've got a very nice approach to that. I think that it marries relatively well with the type of approach I've talked about, this kind of integrated approach, this results-based approach. But there is always a risk there, and I do always fear this idea of the perhaps the capitalist approach that brought us to the point that we're consuming a massive amount. Is that the best model to go and get us out of the issue that we're in? I'm not sure. I do fear that, and I do see a lot of interest in buying peatland by those that are maybe not from the area. That's okay, absolutely fine. But they're often investors that are maybe cashing in on carbon credits or what they hope would be a good investment in future. And the implications locally then are elevated land use prices, maybe the margin of rhododendron and so on. So yeah, I think there's a big debate there on that one.
It is an interesting debate, and effectively what I think a lot of these projects are, they might be termed payments for ecosystem services. I suppose it depends on how it's done at the end of the day. We have a question here from an anonymous attendee about how important would you say it is to restrict the free and unrestricted movement of grazing sheep on these landscapes? And maybe you might comment as well, it's not part of the question, but is there a role for cattle in these areas, or would you consider cattle to be more maybe eco-friendly than sheep?
I might get you to remind me of the first question in a second, but just on the cattle side of things, yeah, I mean, light cattle are, very, very useful in the uplands. I think one of the problems that we've kind of gone into is not as much intensification as specialization. In the past, your commonage shares related to what cattle you're putting up there, and you brought them down at a certain time of year because you had to bring them down. You had your inside land. No, there weren't easy times, of course, but it was managed in a way that you could live next year and the year after. In some instances, we've got tons of peat been washed off down the river, and I think where you have instances like that, that's not good for anybody. That certainly I wouldn't want half my land, washing away down the river. And if you wouldn't want half of your green field washing away, why would you let that happen with your hill as well? So I don't think anyone wants that. I think in some instances, and again, I think where policy has brought us is to certain practices with just sheep, where those that are kind of, we'll call them sheep men, as this locally they would be called, use a lot of different areas of given hills, and have an approach towards it, and some mightn't agree with it and whatever else as well. Others will have their minimum number of sheep that they have to draw down payments and throw them inside the gate and close the gate and feed them every evening. They'll race back from wherever they're working, and that's essentially just to draw down the payments. And then you've got these areas that tend to be closer to roads and whatever that are absolutely hammered, and that's a major problem, you know. And that's a perverse outcome of a broader policy that does nobody any good, any favors whatsoever, you know. So did I answer the first part of that question, Porrick? Because I didn't get
Yes, I think you did. Yeah,
okay.
I think you did, and I suppose we're back to our policies really, and it's a recurring theme. I mean, I mentioned we did a webinar earlier on the Water Framework Directive, and you spoke about water quality, and again the policies pulling in different directions was an underlying theme there as well. But you have sounded an optimistic note, I think. I mean, in your presentation, and I'm grateful for that because I think we do have an immense challenge ahead of us in the coming decade or so, and we have to feel that we can do it. And I think the work that you and your colleagues are doing are showing that it can be done, and I think that's really important. So look, it's 8 o'clock now, and I'm sorry if I didn't get to the other questions, but I really appreciate everybody giving their time this evening to come along and to listen to this important talk. And to you, Derek, I'm very grateful to you for your time and effort, and we wish you the very best in the future years of this project. It's extremely important work. It's vital, I would say, on many fronts, and we wish you all the best with it. So thank you again, everybody, and we'll see you next time. So long.
Thanks very much. Bye, everybody.